Greetings, Kerbonauts. This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is Operation Gold Strike. What is this, and where is my Project Odyssey? Where is Project Alexandria? Even where is Project Enterprise? Why are we doing something new today? Well, I am working on a very special Project Odyssey episode that is going to take a long time to finish. And right now, Real Solar System is not ready to be used with version 1.02, which is what I'm on. And Project Alexandria and Enterprise both rely on Real Solar System, so I'm going to wait until RSS is ready to be used on 1.02 before I continue Alexandria and Enterprise. And since Odyssey is waiting for its very special episode number 46 to be completed, which is going to take so long to do, I want to provide you with something rather than nothing at all, and that's what this is going to be. Operation Gold Strike is going to be a mini-series. It won't be very long. It's going to focus on mining operations and just how to go from pretty much absolutely nothing to having a full scan of Minmus, as well as a space station orbiting around little old Minmus, ready to convert your ore into fuel oxidizer and monopropellant for refueling operations. The parts will be completely stock, although I will have some beautification and utility mods going. But you won't be required to have any of those if you want to follow along. And speaking of following along, since this is fully stock, I am going to provide the files that you can download. All the crafts will be usable by you. So you'll be able to go and scan the same way that I am and make the same space station I've got and fly the same craft here and there. And along the way, perhaps you'll learn a thing or two. All right, so let's get started. We are going to use Minmus for this mining operation because it is so much easier to get down and back up from Minmus, carrying all that heavy ore than it would be if we were doing it at the moon. And the difficulty of getting to Minmus is pretty much about the exact same as getting to the moon if you do it right, and that's what we're going to do here. So step one is we need to get Minmus into the proper location. How are we going to know when it's in the right spot? Well, you're going to target Minmus and then get Minmus on your screen, visible right on the edge of Kerbin. And then you're going to fast forward until mission control is coming up right beside Minmus. There should be a very small gap between the edge of the planet, Minmus, and your craft at mission control. In other words, it would be as if Minmus were rising, coming up over the horizon for the first time of the day. At that point, we're going to switch back to our local view of our craft, hit spacebar, and off we go. If you're using the craft file that I built, then you can just full throttle, hit Z, and turn on the SAS with T. And if you're wondering, where do I get this craft file you're talking about? Well, down in the comments of this video, there is going to be a link. Go there and you'll be able to get your hands on all the craft files. Once again, I will remind you, don't freak out. Project Odyssey and Alexandria will return. This is just a mini series. The reason I'm doing this, a mining operation from Minmus where we will refuel craft, is this was the most common comment that I got after I made my tutorial on how to do mining operations. Specifically, that people wanted to know exactly how you do it from the ground up, not just how to scan and drill, but how do you make it all work? How do the pieces fit together in the puzzle? What sorts of decisions go into how you set this up? Why am I doing it that way? And various other lessons that may go along with setting up a full operation. For now, we're just doing a simple, ordinary launch with a regular old start at 1,000 meters on your gravity turn and keep pitching over until about 10 kilometers up you're going, roughly 45 degrees. Keep pointing over a little bit more and a little bit more, and eventually you're going to see Minmus on the horizon. If you're not seeing Minmus right around that terminator line in your nav ball of where the blue and the brown come together, then you didn't launch at about the right time. At this point, you want to be slowly pitching over, stay inside the yellow circle that represents which direction your craft is going. Keep that nose indicator right in there, but on the edge closer to where the indicator for Minmus is. You want to slowly drag those two together. Eventually you're going just about straight at it. By that point, we will have decoupled our side boosters and perhaps even managed to get ourselves up into a relatively high altitude where we can shut down the main engine and decouple the lower stage. I had a little bit of fuel left in that lower stage, but we're not going to need it at this point. Once I cross over that 70 to 72 kilometer altitude on my apoapsis point, we're ready to use the upper stage to do the rest of the maneuvers. It'll be a little bit easier to manipulate that stage. It's not as heavy, so it'll move around and face the maneuver node that we need to set up a whole lot easier. Speaking of the maneuver node, you should see an ascending-descending node indicator right in front of you on your orbit. That's where the maneuver node is going to go. Then you just drag out prograde until you are intercepting with Minmus. As simple as that. If you need to make a tiny tweak on the inclination, use those purple arrows, the up and down, probably dragging a little bit up to get that final inclination intercepting over where you want it there at Minmus. Line yourself up with the maneuver and make sure you're going, because you probably don't have any more time than it takes to create the maneuver before you need to already be burning for it. Next up, it's time to release the fairing, and technically we could have gotten rid of that back down as low as 20 kilometers, but releasing it up here when we get to space is a little bit more realistic, so I'm doing that just for the realism. We're almost done with the maneuver now, so it's time to scroll out and take a look at Minmus and see how close we're coming. This is about the point where I usually delete my maneuver, throttle down, and then go very, very slowly, watching the real orbit to see where it's going to intercept. And once we get that intercept, then we just stop by hitting the X and terminating that engine. Eventually, we are going to want a polar orbit around Minmus, which means going over the North Pole and around to the other side, down around the South Pole, and back up again about as straight up and down over Minmus as we can get. So we'll be making a maneuver to take care of that, and I find that it's much easier to do that, to see that, if you use a different form of conics view than what normally comes in the stock game. So now, let's go take a look at how you set that up. So here in my Steam Apps Common folder, you can see I have a whole bunch of different versions of the game from 0.25, 0.9, all the way up to 102. So we'll just go into 102 here, and you're going to see that there's this file right here called settings. It's a .cfg file. We want to open up that settings file because in here you're going to find a section, a little line that says conics view. Just a little way down, right about here, you can see that right there, conic patch draw mode. Normally, you're going to see a 3 in your game if you haven't changed it. I change it to 0. 0 is what is going to give you that view where you can see the lines right over there by Minmus. Also, while you're there, if you want to increase the patch limit, you might increase that up to something like a 5. I'll do that right now while we're here. So with that set, by double-clicking on Minmus, we focus on Minmus, allowing us to scroll in and out and look close at it and see the line that goes past it. Because now we want a maneuver that's close to Minmus, but not quite there, where we're going to drag it until we can get that orbit going more polar. It will be so cheap to do it from the distance where we are that we could probably make the entire maneuver on just the RCS system. I have RCS on this, although normally the RCS is going to be turned off for me because I really don't need it. I can maneuver it with the gyroscope when I need to. The RCS is going to be used just for fine adjustments, and there probably won't be many, but if you need it, it's there. I have action groups set up for the solar panels and the scanning dish. Number 1 opens up the solar as soon as you're free floating. But if you should find that you have forgotten to bring out the solar panels and you do something like run out of power, there is an extra battery on here that is disabled. Go to that battery and re-enable it. That will allow you to open up the solar. Also, if you don't want to have any orbital debris, you probably want to switch over to the final injection stage that you were using, that Kerbal departure stage. Do a little radial maneuver until your periapsis drops down into the atmosphere, and then you can let that go until it gets burned up or crashes into the planet's surface. Back at the satellite, we're waiting for that maneuver node before we can try to go into our polar orbit. And this will give me a chance to talk about the mods. Now, I said I don't have any extra parts. Well, that's not entirely true. I, of course, had to add surface lights. So if you're going to use this, you need the regular stock game, surface lights, and then whatever plugins you desire. In my case, I have added a number of plugins. I'll bring up the list on the left right here. This is my directory structure. There are some fairly standard mods now that lots of people use, like the toolbar and module manager. I've also got a bunch of beautification and just enhancement type mods, visual enhancements, distant object, engine lights, curb inside, hot rockets, planet shine, RCS sounds, and then a few just utility plugins, like the enhanced nav ball or fuse box, curb cam, mech jeb so I can get a customized window for delta V stats and my apoapsis, periapsis, just visual readouts, navy fish for docking, quick go-to to jump around from scene to scene, alarm clock, alternate resource panel, and I'm sure I will be adding a few more beyond all of these. But I will be keeping it stock as far as the parts, just so it's easier for you to follow along, other than, of course, the surface lights, because you gotta have more lights. Back at Minmus, we have set up a maneuver node just inside the SOI. Even though we're not technically in the SOI yet, there's a little bit more warping to go to get there, but once we are, that's where we'll maneuver to make sure we go into the polar orbit we're looking for. In fact, on second thought, after we cross into the SOI, let's delete that and set it up one more time, because if we're in the SOI of Minmus, we'll know for sure that we have exactly the right trajectory for that maneuver node. We'll get that going to about 60 kilometers over the surface, as straight up and down as we can get it, and then like I did before, we'll point ourselves in the right direction, but delete the maneuver node and just watch the real orbit powering up the engines only a little tiny bit so that we ease ourselves into the right trajectory. Shut down once we get it, and then wait until we get to that periapsis where we can do another burn to circularize an orbit around Minmus. I'm using the Kerbal alarm clock to make sure that I stop at my maneuver nodes automatically, but if you're not using that plugin, just left click on that orbit and select warp to the next maneuver node, and that'll do the same thing. Once we get there, line up for that retro burn, start up the engines one last time, and capture your orbit. For that scanner to function, you must be above 25 kilometers and under 300. At least those are the numbers for Minmus. It varies by location. Your orbit's as circular as it's going to get at this point once the apoapsis and periapsis are the same distance in either direction from where you are right then. The next order of business is to open up the scanner and click to perform the orbital scan, and boom, in the upper left you can see that that scan is now complete. On the right-hand side, third button down in the little buttons there, click that and we can access our resource information, making sure that we've selected that we want to see the surface ore, changing up our style to what we like, and I like this sort of solid view, and also changing the color, which I like to go to the green to red heat map style. We can also adjust the percentage cutoff to show where the highest concentration of ore is. By clicking up until only a slight patch of red appears, we now know that this is the best location to find our ore. In your game, it will be slightly different from mine, of course, but you should be able to find something nonetheless. I will not be dissecting the entire craft in the VAB like I might normally do in a different series. Instead, we're going to go over some of the major differences from what you might expect. For example, we will start down here on the boosters. I have set a thrust limiter of 57% on those. That was specifically to get this roughly 1.6, going anywhere from 1.6 to 1.7 thrust to weight ratio is what I'm looking for on my initial stage. It helps to make the gravity turn a little bit easier. The fact that the next stage up was 1.67 was very nice as well, and that is on this engine where it is running at full thrust from the minute you launch until the minute it gets shut down. So it's nice that it doesn't need to be throttled at any point. Also, these little retro boosters on the side are marked at the same, coincidentally, 57% on the Separatrons. I probably could go anywhere from 57 up to 100 on those, but I didn't want these boosters to fly far away too fast because I think it looks cooler when they sort of just drift off to the side. And that is the same reason why up here, if you look at these little boosters, they're reduced down. The Separatrons are at 20% thrust. There's a couple of them in there. Notice they're angled to thrust to the sides of the main tank to make sure that there isn't very much damage going to the tank from the heat of those boosters as they fire. They're simply down here underneath that cap. Using the new feature that allows you to offset things, I have modified these Separatrons to be retro boosters, pulling away this lower stage, sinking them a little bit into the side of that tank. When you have the offset mode on like that, and you left click on an object, you can toggle how you're viewing this little circle thing by hitting the F key. Notice right there I have gone into offset absolute mode, and this just moves it around relative to the VAB. But if I hit F again, it puts it into offset mode. That makes it relative to itself. So since I have rotated it just a little bit to make it fit in there, this makes it easier to slide it in and out of the tank and get just the right distance that I want from the edge. Up here, you're going to see that I did not use the decoupler that is really big and fat, this one in between right there. Instead, I used a stack separator, which means that this tank is going to drop away, and this decoupler, as well as the shroud that goes over the engine, will drop away as a separate piece. That was partially an aesthetics reason, because this one is just so much thicker. I don't like the look of it as much compared to this one, but it's also because the shroud that goes over the engine will stay connected to the bottom with this one, and then runs more of a risk of bumping up against the engine on its way off. Once again, up here we have sunk in some Separatrons, and these have been reduced both in solid fuel and in thrust. This stage up here is going to be so light when it gets pulled away that it doesn't take very much thrust at all to back it off, and so that's why this is reduced way down. Also, the solid fuel is way down because at that low of a thrust, if this were still up at 8, this thing would be burning for like 30 seconds. So instead we reduce that down to just burn it for a few seconds only. There is a CPU on this stage so that if I want to control this stage, I can do that in order to do a retro burn and send it back to Kerbin for destruction, reducing our orbital debris count. Other than that, there isn't anything really special going on. This battery is normally attached to this stage right here. That's the battery to provide extra battery backup in case we need it for this stage to gain power to be able to do its retro burn. And then up here, it's everything that you'd expect to be seeing all the way from the scanner down to the engine. Other than this extra battery right here has been disabled. You see that right there. So if you run out of battery, that can be toggled on to restore power just long enough to go, oh, that's right, I was supposed to open the solar panels, and then you can open these up. Those are on an action group over here. We have action group 1 for the solar and action group 2 for the deploy scanner. And that is it. Back at Kerbin, we're doing the same thing we did earlier where we wait for Minmus to come around to the side of Kerbin for our launch. However, I also, in this case, want to wait until the sun is over there as well. That way we'll be launching at least in the morning, providing some illumination for the launch rather than launching at night where it's going to be so much harder to see. What we are launching is another scanner. We've already done the orbital scanner. Now it's time for the ground scanner. We need to do a surface scan, and then we need to identify the landing site where our ground base is going to go. We're going to do a ground base down on the surface where we can do our mining, and we're going to do a space station where ore can be taken up for refining, and we'll have a little ferry craft that will take it back and forth, go back and forth between the surface and the space station, taking that ore up there. We're flying this the same as we did the first one in this episode because it is in fact the exact same lower stage. The booster was a sub-assembly I saved, built our ground scanning rover, attached that on top of that booster, and off we go. Just like our first one, we'll get ourselves up into a higher altitude, apoapsis above 70 kilometers, then set up another maneuver node that will take us straight over to Minmus. We're not even going to bother circularizing. We should be able to get an intercept since Minmus was rising as we were launching. There are some solar panels on top of the rover that you could orient toward the sun for the journey over to Minmus. There's also a backup battery and a fuel cell. You can probably leave the fuel cell off until you're down on the surface. The backup battery can be flipped on when we arrive at Minmus in order to do our maneuvers, and then flip back off again to conserve power when we're not doing maneuvers. And that's all assuming that you can't keep the solar panels pointed at the sun. They're on the top to make it easier for when it's down on the surface to be able to get some solar power. But if you end up needing to run it at night, then you have the fuel cell. Now, as for our arrival trajectory, we could have come in along the equator, we can come in polar. Minmus is so small, it almost really doesn't matter, but in this case, I guess I came in polar, just like we did with the other scanner, even though we're going to end up on the ground. In some ways, this can make things easier because once you get into that polar orbit, you can just go around and around and around until your landing site comes under your orbit for the ground vehicle. Whereas if you were on the equator and you wanted to go to something that was up above or below that equator, you'd have to make an inclination change as well, which who knows, maybe you're not going to have enough fuel for that. In this case, I could have done anything I want. There's so much fuel on this rover on such a light moon that it just doesn't matter. So here we are, ready to land, orbiting around in a polar orbit, waiting for that red splotch to come under our landing site while at the same time having that be in the sun. Right now, it's in the dead of night over there. So we wait until that landing site's in the sun, and then as our rover is about to come over, we can set up a maneuver node that will now bring us down on top, keeping in mind that Minmus is rotating just a little bit, so we're going to have to lead our target just a touch. A little maneuver node here will allow us to set up that trajectory to bring us down in the basin. We're quite fortunate that it is in the basin. It should be nice and flat there for us to make a base. So while we wait for our lander to get into position for the landing, I'll let you know that the Project Odyssey episode we're waiting for, episode 46, is 5 minutes in. I'm not sure how many minutes it's going to be total, but I'll keep you updated in each episode of Operation Goldstrike to let you know how close we are. And you'll get it as soon as it's done. Here over the surface of Minmus, you can see that the rover has decoupled from that stage that brought us all the way here. It's rocketing down to the surface where theoretically it would explode. However, it doesn't. It strikes the ground and some debris bounces away off into the distance. The gravity is so low here that our rover can easily maneuver into a position where it's coming straight down, throttling up to nearly full power because I have done a thrust limiter on the engines to make sure it's easier to control how much throttle we have here as we lower ourselves down and gently touch down on the ground. There is a gyroscope on the underside of the rover belly, and you're going to want to disable that for maneuvering around on the surface. If you don't, then you're going to be flipping your rover rather than rolling it across. On the back side, we have our surface scanner, so we need to activate that so that we can unlock this entire basin's biome. Then activate the spinning narrowband scanner that's up on top, bring up the user interface, and look for where a nice high concentration of ore is going to be found. And as it turns out, it is down south of us, maybe a little bit to the east as well. We can get well over 8%. So that's where we want to take our little rover. If you right-click on the surface scanner and keep that up the entire time you're driving, it will occasionally automatically update itself to show the percentage of ore that's underneath where you are right now. And then you can just stop in the right location. And while you're getting there, keep the narrowband scanner open and occasionally hit refresh and double-check where you currently are relative to where you want to be. I drove this little guy for the next couple minutes to get ourselves over to the edge of the basin, right along the edge where that hill comes down and just barely starts to cut into our flats here. That's where it seems that our high 8+% concentration of ore is going to be. So we're going to stop there, and then later we'll be able to use the rover as an indicator of where we want to land our first base module. I probably don't need the rover anymore, so I'm shutting it down for now. We can activate it again later. Shutting it down means disabling the battery, disabling the fuel cell, and we'll just leave it here waiting for us for the next time on Operation Goldstrike. where we will bring ourselves a ground base over here and get drilling. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbonauts.